Bye. First video. So blank slate, brand new cast, Koi, previous character carryover Nahi. Here's the opening package, your 3 curiosity titles, the quick thumbnail text, then first killing, paste ready narration. Tummeter. 3 title options curiosity gap. No answer given. Nothing overpromised. 1. As my best friend begged me to save his house. 4 years later, I learned the truth. Tummeter F. 2F. I gave my lifelong friend my entire life savings for an emergency. The emergency never existed. For 50 years, he was my best friend. Then I finally opened the note he told me never to read. I click thumbnail, text idea, 2-4, bold words, don't open it. Part 1. The clerk slid the folder back across the counter and told me there was nothing in it. No foreclosure, no lien. No notice of default. In 22 years, not one single day had Danny Kessler's house ever come close to being taken by anybody. And I just stood there, in that quiet little records office off the county courthouse lobby, with my life savings gone. $217,000 I had wired to my best friend to rescue a house that was never, not for one single hour, in any kind of danger. In my coat pocket was a folded note, sealed. Cream-colored paper, gone soft at the corners from 4 years shut in a drawer. Danny pressed it into my hand. The same afternoon, he took the money, and he told me not to open it, so I never did. And now the one man alive, who could have explained any of this, had been in the ground for a year and a half. Look, I spent 31 years reconciling other men's books, finding the $1 that didn't belong on a page of 10,000. I never once imagined I'd be standing over the accounts of the man I loved like a brother, trying to figure out where my money really went and why he looked me dead in the eye and lied to my face. Let me back up. Because to understand how a careful man hands over everything he owns on a Friday morning without asking a single question, you have to understand Danny. I met Daniel Kessler when we were 9 years old, down at the creek that runs under the Route 7 bridge. He was the loud one. Big kid, always half a size too big for his shoes. The boy who'd jump off the high rock before he'd checked how deep the water was. I was the other kind. I was the boy who checked. I counted the seconds it took a stone to hit the bottom before I ever put a toe in. Danny used to laugh at me for that. Said I could turn a swim into a math problem. 50 years later, he was still saying it. We grew up 2 streets apart and never really left. He married Carol out of the same high school. I married my Della. Danny built Kessler Millwork out of a 1-car garage into a real cabinet shop with 11 men on the floor. Beautiful work. The kind of built-in bookcases that outlive the house they're in. And me, I kept the books at Hartwell Supply, a regional building supply outfit, for 31 years, until the day they handed me a cake and a folding chair and called it retirement. I was good at it. I'll say that plain, because it matters later. I once caught a $40,000 hole in our payables that 3 auditors had walked right past, not because I'm smart, but because I'm patient, and numbers don't lie the way people do. A man can smile at you and shake your hand and tell you a beautiful story. His ledger can't. His ledger just sits there and tells you exactly what he did. That was my whole career. I read numbers the way other men read faces. And here's the thing about me you should know before I go any further. I drink my coffee black, no sugar, never have taken it any other way. I keep every receipt I've ever been handed in labeled envelopes in a metal box in the garage, and when a room goes quiet at the wrong moment, I count the seconds. 1, 2, 3. I've never been able to stop myself. Della used to reach over under the table and squeeze my knee when she caught me doing it. She passed 4 years ago. The cancer took her in 9 months. And Danny was the one who sat in my kitchen every night that first terrible week, not saying much, just being there so I wasn't alone in a house that had gone silent. So when Danny showed up at my door that Tuesday afternoon, I owed him more than money. I owed him for the silence he sat through with me. He didn't look right when I opened the door. Danny Kessler was a man who filled a doorway, and that day he seemed to hang back from it. His hands were shaking. I'd never seen that. He wouldn't take the coffee I offered. He sat at my kitchen table and turned his wedding ring around and around, and finally he told me the bank was calling the note on the house. Carol's house, the house she'd grown up in, the house they'd raised Renee in. He said there'd been trouble at the shop, a run of bad quarters, and he borrowed against the place to cover payroll, and it had gotten away from him. He said if he didn't put $217,000 in front of them by Friday, they'd take it. And then he said the thing that undid me. He said, I have never once asked you for a dime in 50 years, Marcus. I'm asking now, and I'm ashamed to be asking. That $217,000 was not just a number to me. That was the lake cabin. And that was the little place up on Miller's Pond that Della and I had circled in a real estate flyer and taped to the refrigerator, the place we were going to retire to together. She never got to see it. And I kept saving toward it anyway, because putting that money somewhere else felt like admitting she was really gone. That money was the last thing my wife and I ever dreamed about out loud. And I wired every cent of it to Danny Kessler on Friday morning without asking him a single question. Because that is what you do. That is what you do for the man who sat in your silence. Real quick, if this story's already got its hooks in you, do me a favor and tap subscribe and give it a like. It genuinely helps me keep making these. Alright, where was I? He came by that same afternoon to thank me. He was more himself again, some color back in his face, and he did a thing that struck me even then as strange. He took a folded note out of his shirt pocket, sealed in a cream-colored envelope, and he pressed it flat into my hand and closed my fingers over it. He said, "Don't open this unless things go bad. Promise me, Marcus." I laughed and asked him what that was supposed to mean. He didn't laugh back. He just held my eyes and said, "Promise me." So I promised. And I put that note in the top drawer of my desk under a stack of old warranty cards, and I let myself forget it was there, because opening it felt like counting the seconds on a stone I didn't want to hear hit the bottom. Danny paid me back nothing that first year, and I never asked. He'd say soon as the spring orders come in, and I'd wave it off. That's the God's honest truth. I'd have forgiven the whole thing and never mentioned it again. Then one gray morning, 2.5 years later, one of his men found Danny face down on the shop floor next to a table saw that was still running. Heart attack. 59 years old, gone before the ambulance turned onto Route 7. I gave the eulogy. I stood up in that packed church, and I told a room full of people that Daniel Kessler was the most generous man I had ever known, and I believed every word of it. Every account settles in the end, I told myself that day. Every single one. I just figured ours had settled the way it should, with him gone and me grateful. Then, at the reception in the church basement, Carol took my hand between both of hers to thank me for coming. And to make conversation, gentle as anything, I said I was just glad we'd been able to keep the house and the family after that scare with the bank. She looked at me like I'd started speaking another language. "What scare?" she said. "Marcus." "Honey, we paid this place off in 2009, and my blood ran cold." At part 2, I told her I'd gotten my years mixed up. That's what I said, standing in that church basement with a paper cup of weak coffee going cold in my hand. I smiled, and I said, "Carol, forgive me. I'm an old fool. I must be thinking of somebody else's trouble." And she patted my arm and moved on to the next mourner, and I stood very still, and I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 11 before the noise of the room came back to me. Because here is what I understood in those 11 seconds. Carol Kessler had no idea what I was talking about. There was no shared story. There was no family cover-up she and Danny had agreed on to spare their pride. If the two of them had cooked up a lie about the bank, she'd have flinched when I said it. I've watched 1,000 faces flinch over 1,000 numbers, and I know exactly what it looks like when somebody's caught. She didn't flinch. She was just confused. Which meant the lie hadn't been built for the world. It had been built for me. Only me. Danny had looked me in the eye, in my own kitchen, with his hands shaking, and he had told me a story he manufactured for an audience of exactly one man. I drove home the long way that night, out past the shuttered Hartwell warehouse and down Route 7, past the creek where 2 9-year-old boys used to jump off the high rock. And the whole way, that note was screaming at me from the drawer of my desk 2 miles ahead. "Don't open this unless things go bad." Well, Danny, things had gone bad. Things had gone about as bad as a friendship can go. And I had made a promise. You want to know the kind of man I am? I got home. I poured myself a black coffee at 9 o'clock at night like a lunatic. I sat down at that desk, and I put my hand flat on the closed drawer, and I did not open it. I'd given my word. A man who breaks his word the minute it costs him something never had any word to begin with. So I made myself a different promise instead. I would find out what happened without touching that envelope. I'd let the numbers tell me the way they always had, and only if the numbers ran out, only then would I break the seal. I want you to understand I wasn't angry yet. That's the strange part. I was hollowed out. 50 years is a long time to be sure of one man, and I felt like the floor of my whole life had been quietly pulled up while I was looking the other way. But grief and anger are 2 different animals, and only one of them was awake in me that night. The other one was still coming. Now, most men in my shoes have got nothing to work with. A wire's a wire. The money leaves, it's gone, and you never see where it lands. But I am not most men, and this is the part Danny forgot about me. Or maybe he counted on me being too heartbroken to remember. I keep everything. Out in the garage, on the second shelf, there's a gray metal box. Inside that box are labeled envelopes, 31 years of them, and I could put my hand on any receipt in under a minute. And in the envelope marked simply K 2021, there was the wire confirmation from my credit union. The full transfer record. $217,000 sent that Friday morning to a receiving account with a routing number and the last 4 digits of the destination account printed right there on the slip. And here's the thing. I had assumed, for 4 years I had assumed, that money went to Kessler Millwork, to the business account, to be handed to a bank, to save a house. I'd built the whole story around that assumption because Danny handed me the assumption and I loved him too much to check it. But I knew the Kessler Millwork account. I'd helped Danny set up his first books back in the 80s, before he could afford anybody better than me doing it for free on Sunday afternoons. I knew that account number the way you know an old phone number that never leaves you. The money on that slip had not gone to Kessler Millwork. It had gone somewhere else entirely. Real quick, before I take you any further down this, if this story's pulling you along, please do me the kindness of hitting that subscribe button and giving the video a like. That's the whole way a channel like mine keeps the lights on. Thank you. Now, let me show you what I found. The next morning, I called the credit union and I did the thing I'd done 10,000 times for other people's money and never once for my own. I asked, politely, professionally, as the sender of a wire, to confirm the receiving institution on a transfer I'd initiated. I had the confirmation number. I had my ID. The young woman on the phone was helpful, and she told me the receiving bank, and it was not the bank Danny did his business with. It was a little online-only outfit I'd never heard him mention in 50 years. Not a business account, she said, based on the routing structure. A personal one. Danny had told me the money was going to a bank to stop a foreclosure. Instead, it had gone straight into somebody's personal checking account. Now I couldn't get the name off the phone. They don't hand you that, and they shouldn't. But I had the last 4 digits of the account, and I had a routing number, and I had something better than either of those. I had a lifetime of learning that money leaves footprints, and footprints lead to a door, and behind every door there's a person, and every person keeps records whether they mean to or not. So I did what I do. I got out a legal pad. I drew 3 columns. And at the top of the first one I wrote everything I actually knew, and at the top of the second I wrote everything Danny had told me, and at the top of the third I wrote the difference between them. And that third column, my friends, was where the truth was hiding, right in the gap between what was real and what I'd been sold. Let me stop here and ask you something, because I've been chewing on it for 4 years, and I'd honestly like to know what you think. If you'd handed your entire life savings to your best friend of 50 years, and then found out the emergency never happened, what would you have done next? Would you have opened that note the second the story cracked? Or would you have kept your word like I did? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you, by the end of this, your answer might surprise even you, because here's where it turned. I took the last 4 digits of that account and I sat with them, and I had this cold, crawling feeling that I'd seen those 4 numbers before. Not similar. The same. And I couldn't place it, and it drove me half out of my mind for 2 days. I went back through that metal box, envelope by envelope, 31 years of them, looking for 4 numbers. And on the 3rd night, I found them. They were on a check. A canceled check from years back, folded into an envelope I'd almost forgotten I had. A check that Danny Kessler himself had once written to a man. A check I'd been handed and kept, the way I keep everything, and never thought about again. The last 4 digits of the account that swallowed my life savings matched, exactly, the account of a man I'd shaken hands with at Danny's own kitchen table. A man who'd been at the funeral. A man who'd looked me in the eye across a church basement and told me how sorry he was for my loss. And when I saw whose name was printed on that check, my hands went cold, and the whole shape of the lie turned over in front of me like a stone rolling off a grave. Part 3, the name on that check was Vaughn Delacroix. And, the second I read it, 40 little things I'd never questioned lined up in a row and pointed the same direction. Vaughn was Danny's brother-in-law, Carol's younger brother. A tall, easy, good-looking man about 10 years behind us. Always in a nice jacket, always with that handshake that lasts a beat too long. The kind of handshake a man uses when he wants you to trust him before you've had a chance to decide for yourself. He called himself an investment consultant. What that meant exactly, nobody in the family could ever quite say, and that was the point. Vaughn was the man who was always about to close something big, always 3 months from the deal that would change everything. For 30 years, he'd been 3 months away, and for 30 years the family had quietly floated him. A loan here, a co-signed lease there, a check they all pretended not to notice. and Danny had written him a check once, years back. That was the canceled check in my box, the one with the matching account. I'd forgotten I even had it. Danny had handed it to me one Sunday to log against something, a shared cost on a hunting lease the two of them and Vaughn had gone in on, back when Della was still alive. I logged it, I filed it, I forgot it. 31 years of doing that for a living, and that habit, that boring little habit Danny used to laugh at me for, had just handed me the name of the man who took my lake cabin. But here's the thing that stopped me cold. Sitting at that desk at 2 a.m, it didn't add up. Not cleanly. Because if Vaughn had simply conned Danny, if Vaughn had spun Danny some story and Danny had turned around and passed the same story to me, then Danny was a victim too. A fool, maybe, but not a liar. And I wanted that to be true so badly I could taste it. I wanted my friend back. I wanted the last 50 years to still mean what I'd always thought they meant. But the numbers wouldn't let me have it, because Danny didn't tell me the money went to Vaughn. Danny told me the money went to a bank to stop a foreclosure on a house that was paid off in 2009. Every single piece of that was invented. A man who's been conned repeats the con he was told. He doesn't build a brand new, better lie on top of it. Danny knew there was no bank. Danny knew there was no foreclosure. Danny sat in my kitchen with his hands shaking, and he manufactured an emergency out of thin air, and he aimed my grief for my dead wife straight at the thing he needed, and he pulled the trigger. The shaking hands. I kept coming back to the shaking hands. I'd read them as shame, as a proud man humbled to be asking. And maybe some of it was. But a man who reads people for a living should have seen the other thing underneath it, and I'd been too gutted by Della to look. Those weren't only the hands of a man ashamed to ask. They were the hands of a man, afraid he'd be caught. Look, if you're still with me and this story's got a hold of you, take 1 second and hit subscribe and like before we go on. I mean it makes a real difference. All right, back to it. Now I had a name, and I had a habit, and I had a metal box full of 31 years of other people's carelessness. What I did next, I did slow. I want to be honest with you about that because I think it matters. I didn't call Vaughn and scream at him. I didn't drive over to Carol's and blow the family apart at the dinner table. I'm not built that way, and besides, I had nothing yet. I had a matching account number and a bad feeling, and you cannot walk into anybody's life and tear it down over a bad feeling. I learned that at Hartwell. You never make the accusation until the page makes it for you. You let the ledger do the talking, because the ledger can't be shouted down, and the ledger never has to apologize. So I started pulling threads, quietly, the way I know how. I called the county again. Not the records clerk this time, but the Register of Deeds, and I pulled the full history on the Kessler house. Every lien, every mortgage, every satisfaction of debt going back 30 years. And Carol was right to the letter. Paid in full, spring of 2009. Not one document filed against that property since. The house had been sitting there free and clear the entire time Danny was telling me it was about to be ripped away from his wife. Then I did something that took me 3 weeks and a lot of swallowed pride. I started asking around, gentle and sideways, about how Kessler Millwork had really been doing in its last years. Not the version Danny told me, the run of bad quarters. The real version. I bought coffee for a retired foreman named Hollis who'd run Danny's shop floor for 2 decades. Good man. Bad knees. Loved to talk once you got him going. And Hollis told me the shop had been fine. Better than fine. He said their last 3 years were the best they'd ever had. A big contract fitting out the new medical building over in the county seat. Steady work, full crew, everybody getting Christmas bonuses. He said Danny never once missed a payroll, not once in 20 years. Then Hollis set his cup down and got quiet, and he said, "You know what was strange though? Money'd go missing off the top sometimes. Danny'd catch it, get this gray look, make it right by Friday, and never say who. We all figured it was family. It was always family with Danny. It was always family with Danny. And there it was, the shape of the whole thing, rising up out of the water like that high rock in the creek. Danny wasn't broke. Danny was a bleeding. Somebody had been drawing money out of that man for years, a little at a time, and Danny had been quietly plugging the holes with his own blood and telling nobody. A proud man. A man who filled a doorway. A man who would rather lie to his oldest friend than admit out loud that he could not stop his own brother-in-law from bleeding him dry. But that still didn't explain the $217,000. A man plugs a payroll hole with a few thousand. He doesn't invent a foreclosure and drain his best friend's life savings for a few thousand. Something had changed. Something had gotten enormous, all at once, in the months before Danny came to my door with shaking hands. Some hole had opened up under that family so big that Danny, proud, generous, drowning Danny, decided the only way out was to lie to the one man on earth who trusted him without checking. I needed to know what that hole was. And I realized, sitting there with my cold coffee and my legal pad, that there was exactly one place left that might tell me. Not the county, not Old Hollis, not the bank, Kessler Millwork's own books, Danny's books. The ones I'd set up for him 40 years ago on a Sunday afternoon, that some bookkeeper had been keeping ever since. If the money had moved, it moved through there first, and it left a footprint, because money always leaves a footprint. And Carol, God bless her, had told me at the funeral that she couldn't make heads or tails of the business paperwork, and would I ever be willing to come look at it as a friend, since I used to do that sort of thing. I'd said no at the time. Too soon, too raw. The next morning, I called Carol back and told her I'd changed my mind. I'd come look at Danny's books, as a friend. And that's the moment. I know it now, though I didn't then, that I stopped grieving my friend and started building a case against a ghost. Every account settles in the end. I just hadn't yet learned how many people were about to be dragged to the table when this one did. Before I go on, let me ask you something, because we've hit the fork in the road. Knowing what I knew? A dead best friend? A living brother-in-law? A lie built just for me? Do you think I should have walked into that grieving widow's house and gone to her dead husband's books looking for the truth? Or should I have let the dead keep their secrets and swallowed the loss? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Because what I found in those books changed everything, and it started with a single-line item, dated 3 weeks before Danny ever came to my door. Part 4 Carol met me at the door in an apron, flour on her hands, trying to feed me before I'd even crossed the threshold. That was Carol. Her husband had been gone 18 months, and she still couldn't let a man into her house without putting food in front of him. She'd set up Danny's old paperwork on the dining room table. Banker's boxes, a battered laptop, a shoebox of receipts held together with a rubber band. She said the bookkeeper had quit 6 months after Danny passed, and she'd been letting it all pile up because every time she opened a box, she smelled his cologne on the folders and had to stop. I told her to go do her baking. I told her I'd be a few hours. And I sat down at Daniel Kessler's dining room table, in the house that was never once in danger, and I opened his books. Now, I want to tell you something about reading a dead man's ledgers. It is the most intimate thing there is. More than letters, more than photographs. A man can lie in a letter. His books are just what he did, day after day, when he thought no one who mattered would ever add it up. And within an hour, I could see Danny in those numbers as clear as if he were sitting across from me. Every quiet kindness he'd never mentioned. Every bonus he slipped a man having a hard year. Every invoice he let slide for a customer going through a divorce. My friend was in those pages, the real one, the generous one, and it broke my heart a little to find him there and know how it ended. And then I found the other thing. 3 weeks before Danny came to my door, there was a transfer out of the Kessler Millwork operating account. $50,000. Memo line, in Danny's own blocky handwriting, V final. Not loan, not advance. She final. The way you write a word when you mean it to be the last time. I sat with that for a long while. V final. Final.h Danny had drawn $50,000 out of his business, handed it to Vaughn, and written it down like a man closing a door for good. 3 weeks later, he was in my kitchen with shaking hands inventing a foreclosure, so the 50 hadn't been final at all. Whatever Vaughn was into, 50,000 hadn't even touched the sides of it, and Danny, proud drowning Danny, had gone back to the only well he had left that Vaughn didn't know about, me. That was why the lie was built for an audience of one. Vaughn couldn't know Danny had a friend with $200,000 in the bank, or Vaughn would have come straight at me himself. Danny was hiding the money's source as much as its purpose. He'd walled me off from the family so completely that Carol didn't even know he'd asked me. He protected Vaughn's crime and my savings in the same breath, and he did it by aiming a lie at the one man who'd never check. Let me take one quick second here. If this story's got a hold of you and you want to see how it lands, do me a favor and hit subscribe and give it a like. It genuinely keeps me going. Okay, back into it. But I still didn't have the shape of the whole thing. 50,000 marked final, then 217 more from me. That's $250,000, and money like that doesn't just evaporate into a man's easy handshake. It goes somewhere. It buys something, or it covers something, or it feeds something. And I needed to know what, because until I did, I had a dead friend who lied to me and a living brother-in-law who took the money, but I did not have the why. I had nothing anybody could act on. A bad feeling and a memo line don't get your life back. So I kept turning pages. And down near the bottom of the last box, underneath the tax folders, there was a large envelope with no writing on it at all. Heavy. Sealed with tape gone yellow and brittle. And every instinct I built over 31 years told me that whatever a careful man hides at the bottom of the last box, under the taxes, in an unmarked envelope, is the one thing he could not bring himself to throw away and could not bear to have found. I did not open it in Carol's house. I want to be honest about why. Partly it was decency. Whatever was in there was Danny's, and Carol was 15 feet away pulling a pie out of the oven, humming to herself, still in love with a man who'd been more complicated than she'd ever know. But partly, if I'm telling you the whole truth, it was fear. Because I had another sealed envelope at home, in my desk drawer, that I'd promised not to open. And I had the sudden, cold certainty that these two envelopes were talking to each other across 4 years, and I was not ready to be in the room when they did. So I asked Carol if I could take a box home to work through properly. She said, "Take whatever you need, honey." And I carried Daniel Kessler's last secret out to my truck under my arm, and I drove home the long way, past the creek, with 2 envelopes now waiting for me instead of 1. I opened Danny's envelope at my kitchen table at midnight, black coffee going cold, the way I do everything. Inside were bank statements. Not Kessler Millworks, not Danny's. They were Von Delacroix's, the personal account, the same one that swallowed my wire. And I will never in my life understand how Danny got hold of his brother-in-law's private statements, except that a drowning man will do things a comfortable man never would. Danny had been keeping his own file on Vaughn. Danny had been building a case, same as I was now, from the other end and years earlier. And what those statements showed made my blood run cold all over again. The money, Danny's 50, and a river of other transfers going back years, wasn't buying a lifestyle. Vaughn wasn't blowing it on cars and vacations the way I'd assumed. It was going out again almost as fast as it came in round numbers, to the same handful of accounts on the same days of the month. Regular, structured, frightened money. The money of a man who owes something to people you do not want to owe, and who is feeding them with everyone else's blood to stay alive one more month. Vaughn wasn't a con man living high. Vaughn was drowning too, and he'd been pulling this whole family down into the water with him, one loving, guilty, secret-keeping person at a time. Danny had just been the strongest swimmer, the one who kept them all up the longest, and when Danny went under, he'd reached for me. But here's the piece that turned my stomach, the piece I read 3 times to be sure. One of those outgoing transfers from Vaughn's account, a big one, dated the very week Danny died, didn't go to the scary round number accounts. It went to a name I recognized. A name that had no business being anywhere near this. A name that meant Vaughn had not been acting alone, and that the betrayal I thought had 2 men in it, one dead, one living, had a third person standing in the shadows the entire time. Someone I'd trusted. Someone who'd stood beside me at the funeral. And that's the moment I finally understood what Danny's note might really say, and why he begged me never to open it. Knees Part 5. The name on that transfer was Renee Kessler, Danny's own daughter. I set the statement down, and I sat in my kitchen, and I counted the seconds, and I got a lot further than 11 that night. Because of everyone on this earth, Renee was the last name I'd have written on that page. I'd bounced that girl on my knee. I'd sat in a folding chair at her high school graduation, and clapped till my hands hurt because Danny was too choked up to do it himself. She was a grown woman now, mid-30s, a nurse over at the same county medical center Kessler Millwork had fitted out, and she had, 3 days before her own father dropped dead on his shop floor, received a large transfer from the very account that was bleeding her family white. My first thought, God forgive me, was the ugly one, that she was in on it, that the girl was working with her Uncle Vaughn, that the whole thing was a family of vultures, and Danny and I were the 2 fools who fed them. That thought lasted about a minute, and then 31 years of reading numbers made me set it down, because it didn't fit the shape. Renee's transfer was the wrong direction. Every other line in Vaughn's statements was money coming into Vaughn and going out to those frightening round number accounts. Renee's was money going out to her, once, alone, unlike anything else on the page. She wasn't a spoke in the wheel that was draining the family. She was the reason the wheel started turning. And here's where the note in my drawer stopped being a mystery I was afraid of and became the only thing I wanted in the world. Because I finally thought I understood what Danny had done. Don't open this unless things go bad. Danny hadn't given me a confession to keep me quiet. He'd given me an insurance policy. He'd handed me, sealed, the one piece of the truth he couldn't say out loud while he was alive and needed to survive him if he wasn't. And he trusted that I, of all people, would keep my word and not open it a single day before I had to. He built his whole desperate plan on the one thing he knew about me for 50 years, that I check the depth before I jump, and that I never, ever break a promise. He wasn't only protecting Vaughn's crime that afternoon, he was protecting her. Real quick, If you're still with me, and I hope to God you are, please tap subscribe and give this a like. We're close to the truth now, and it means the world to have you here for it. All right. Let me tell you what I did next, because I did not open that note. Not yet. I'd made myself a rule, remember? The numbers first, the envelope last. And there was one number left I didn't have. I needed to know what Renee's money was for, so I did the hardest thing in this whole story. I called her. I asked if I could take her to lunch. The diner on Route 7, the one by the creek where her dad and I ate breakfast for 40 years. She said yes before I'd finished asking. And when she slid into that booth across from me, I saw something I hadn't let myself see at the funeral. Because at the funeral, everyone's face is wrong. She looked haunted, 35 years old and carrying something that had aged her a decade. She ordered coffee and didn't drink it. I didn't ambush her. I'm not built that way, and besides, you never make the accusation until the page makes it for you. And the page hadn't, not all the way. So I just told her, gently, that I'd been helping her mother with Danny's books, and that I'd come across a transfer, and that I wasn't there to accuse anybody of anything. I just needed to understand, because her father had asked me for money before he died and told me a story that turned out not to be true, and I loved him too much to let the lie be the last thing he ever gave me. And Renee Kessler put her face in her hands, right there in the diner booth, and she told me everything. The money her Uncle Vaughn sent her, the transfer that scared me so badly, was the money he'd stolen coming back. Not to her. Through her. Vaughn had gotten Renee, 2 years before, to co-sign on what he swore was a short-term business bridge, a legitimate deal, papers and all, the usual Vaughn magic, 3 months from changing everything. She was young, she trusted him, he was family, and she signed. And of course, there was no deal. Vaughn had used his own niece's name and credit and steady nurse's salary as collateral to borrow from the kind of people who don't file paperwork with the county, and then he defaulted, and then the whole crushing weight of it landed on her. She was the one legally on the hook. She was the one they'd come for. That transfer into her account was Vaughn, in a rare spasm of guilt or fear, throwing a little of the stolen money back at her to cover a payment before it destroyed her credit and her nursing license and her whole life. Danny had found out. Of course, Danny had found out. And Danny had done the only thing a father like that could do. He'd stepped in front of the whole thing. The $50,000 marked fee, final, was Danny buying his daughter's name back, or trying to, paying down the monster so it would let go of Renee. And when 50 wasn't enough, when the hole turned out to be a $250,000 hole, Danny had come to my kitchen with shaking hands and invented a foreclosure, because he could not, would not, say the true sentence out loud. My brother-in-law used my daughter as collateral, and now men are going to ruin her, and I cannot stop it, and I am ashamed to my bones. He lied to me to save her. And he sealed the truth in an envelope and made me promise not to open it, because if it ever came out while he lived, Renee's name was in it. The co-signing, the default, all of it, and it could have cost her the nursing license she'd bled to earn. He'd rather I hated him from beyond the grave than have his daughter's career die with him. I looked at that haunted girl across the table, and I understood that the $217,000 I'd been mourning, my lake cabin, Della's dream, the last thing my wife and I ever planned out loud, had gone to buy this young woman her life back. And I found, to my own surprise, that I could not be sorry for it. Della would not have been sorry for it. That, more than anything, was when the grief finally started to turn into something else. But, and here is the thing, here is the loop that wouldn't close. Renee's rescue and my money still didn't square. Danny paid the 50, I sent the 217, and Renee sat across from me and told me, wiping her eyes, that as far as she knew, the debt in her name had never been cleared. She was still getting the calls. She was still terrified. The monster still had its teeth in her. So where did my money go? $217,000, wired to save this girl, and the girl was never saved. Vaughn Delacroix had taken it. All of it. He'd let Danny believe it was going to buy Renee free, and instead he'd fed it to his own frightening creditors to keep his own head above water one more month, and let his niece keep drowning, and let his brother-in-law die 3 weeks later thinking he'd finally fixed it. And that cold, small, unforgivable thing was the moment my grief finished turning. That was the moment I stopped being a heartbroken old man going through a dead friend's boxes. Vaughn had underestimated exactly one thing in this whole affair. He'd looked at me across that church basement, quiet old Marcus, the accountant, the widower, the soft touch who'd wire money without asking a question, and he'd seen a man too gentle and too grieving to be any threat to anybody. He'd never once bothered to wonder what a man who keeps 31 years of receipts and labeled envelopes might do with a paper trail. Before I take you into what I did with it, Because now, finally, I did something. Let me ask you straight. A dead father who lied out of love. A daughter still drowning. And the one man who caused all of it still walking around in a nice jacket, shaking hands too long, believing he got away clean. Do you think a man like Vaughn deserves what's coming to him? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Because what I did next, I did stone cold sober, with clean hands, and it started with a single phone call that Vaughn Delacroix never in 100 years saw coming. And on part 6, the phone call was to Renee, and all I said was, bring me the papers. Every single thing you ever signed for your uncle. Every letter those people ever sent you. Every voicemail you were too scared to delete. Don't throw out one more thing. Because here is what Vaughn never understood, and what Danny understood so well he built his whole last act around it. A frightened person hides the paper. A careful person keeps it. Renee had been hiding hers in a drawer the way you hide something you can't look at, but she'd kept it, every terrifying page, because some quiet part of her knew that one day the paper would be the only thing that could save her. She just needed someone who wasn't afraid of it, and I have never in my life been afraid of a piece of paper. Paper is the one thing in this world that can't lie to you. We spread it all across my kitchen table over 3 long evenings. Renee and me and a whole lot of black coffee. And I did the thing I did for 31 years, the boring, patient, invisible thing. I built the ledger. I put Vaughn's stolen river next to Danny's secret file, next to Renee's loan papers, next to my own wire confirmation from the metal box in the garage, and I laid them end to end until they told one single unbroken story that no handshake on earth could talk its way out of. And the story the paper told was this. Vaughn Delacroix had used a young woman's name and credit, without her understanding what she signed, to obtain money he never intended to repay. He had, on paper, taken funds intended for one specific purpose, clearing that debt and diverted them to his own creditors. And he had, in Danny's own private statements, been doing versions of this to his family for the better part of a decade. It wasn't a bad feeling anymore. It wasn't a memo line, it was a case of. The kind that gets a name and a docket number. I want to be careful how I say this next part, because it matters to me that you understand who I am. I never once thought about hurting Vaughn Delacroix, not with my hands. That's not justice, that's just a second crime, and it would have made me his equal instead of his ruin. Danny didn't leave me his daughter's future so I could go throw it away swinging at a man in a parking lot. A man wins the way I know how to win, patiently, on paper with clean hands. Or he doesn't really win at all. Quick word, and then I promise we're into the home stretch. If this story has meant something to you, please subscribe and give it a like. It's the whole reason I get to keep telling these. Thank you for staying with me. Now, let me tell you how it ended. I took the ledger, the whole thing, bound and copied and organized the way I used to hand things to auditors, and Renee and I took it to a lawyer. A real one. A quiet, sharp woman who did elder fraud and financial exploitation work, and who went very still when she reached the 3rd page and did not move again until she'd read the last. When she finished, she looked up at Renee and she said the words that girl had been waiting 2 years to hear. She said, "You're not the one who's in trouble here. You're the victim." And this, she put her hand flat on my ledger. This is the cleanest paper trail I have ever been handed by someone who wasn't a professional. I didn't correct her. 31 years. I just let it stand. What happened to Vaughn happened slowly, and it happened by his own hand, and that's the only kind of justice I've ever trusted. The lawyer took the case to the people whose job it is to take such cases. Because Renee had been defrauded, her signature obtained under false pretenses, her name used as a shield, the debt in her name came apart under a real light the way all of Vaughn's deals eventually came apart, only this time there was someone standing there with the paper to make sure it fell on the right man. The obligation lifted off Renee, and it settled, with the full weight of 2 years of interest and lies, exactly where it belonged. Vaughn's whole life had been a man staying 3 months ahead of the truth, and you cannot stay ahead of a ledger. A ledger doesn't get tired. It doesn't get talked out of things. It just sits there and tells everyone, quietly, exactly what you did. The frightening round number creditors, once the fraud was documented and the law was involved, were the least of Vaughn's problems, because now the family knew. Carol knew. She learned at 63 years old that her own brother had used her granddaughter, Renee's little girl, as mother's as collateral, and had let her husband die believing he'd fixed a thing that was never fixed. There's a particular kind of ruin that doesn't need a courtroom. It's the ruin of the last person who was still willing to write you a check finally, at long last, closing the book. Vaughn lost the only thing he had left, which was a family soft-hearted enough to keep saving him. What goes around comes around. The chickens came home to roost. He got a taste of exactly what he'd been feeding everyone else for 10 years. He never went to prison, if that's what you're hoping. Fraud like his rarely does. It's too slow, too papered over, too tangled in family. But he lost his name in the only place a name like Vaughn's has any value, which is among the people who used to trust him. He lost the jacket and the handshake and the 3 months from now. He ended up, last I heard, in a rented room 2 states away, calling people who no longer pick up. A man like that, cut off from anyone left to charm, that's its own kind of prison, and it's the kind he built for himself, brick by brick, over 30 years. I didn't put him there. He did. I just handed everyone the blueprint he'd been hiding. And then, just when it all seemed settled, just when Renee was free and Carol had grieved the second worst loss and the whole thing seemed finally, quietly over, I came home one evening and remembered the note. The note was still in the drawer, sealed. 4 years and change now. Don't open this unless things go bad. And here's the twist I did not see coming. The last turn on a road I thought I'd reached the end of. Because I'd solved it all without the note. The numbers had done it exactly like I'd promised myself they would. I'd never had to break my word. I'd earned the whole truth the patient way. So I honestly believed, sliding open that drawer, that the note was going to be nothing now. A confession I already knew, a name I already had. I thought I was opening it just to close a loop, just to hear Danny's voice one last time. I broke the seal. And it was not a confession at all. It was a letter, to Meg. Dated the same afternoon he took the money. And it did not say one word about Vaughn, or Renee, or the debt, or any of the things I'd spent months digging out of boxes. Danny had trusted me to find all of that on my own. He knew I would, he says so, right there in his blocky handwriting. If you're reading this, then something went wrong. And knowing you, you've already figured out most of it, because you always were the one who checked. The letter was Danny telling me he was sorry. Not for the lie, for something else. He wrote that the $217,000 was never supposed to be a gift, that his plan, his real plan, was to pay me back every cent within 2 years out of the medical building contract, and that he'd already set the money aside, quietly, in an account I'd find the number 2 at the bottom of the page. He wrote that if he was gone before he could hand it to me himself, then I was to take what was mine and not argue about it, and use the rest, and there was a rest, more than I'd sent, to do the one thing he knew I'd never do for myself. Buy the cabin, Marcus. Buy the place on the pond you and Della circled on that flyer. You've kept that money like a shrine for 4 years, and she'd want you living, not saving. Let me do this one thing. You sat in my silence. Let me buy back some of yours. He'd meant to save his daughter and his friend. He ran out of time to do the second half, so he left it in a sealed envelope and trusted a man he'd known for 50 years to keep a promise long enough to find it. I drove up to Miller's Pond that spring. I bought the little place Stella and I circled on a real estate flyer a lifetime ago and taped to our refrigerator. There's a porch that faces the water, and in the evenings I sit out there with a black coffee going cold in my hand, and I don't count the seconds anymore. I don't need to. I already know how deep the water is, I checked. A note that meant nothing to anyone but me. That's what I called it, all those years it sat in the drawer. I had it exactly backward, it meant everything. I just had to become the man who'd earned the right to read it first. Every account settles in the end. Mine settled on a porch by a pond, with clean hands, and a friend I got to forgive after all. If this story stayed with you, if you'd like to hear more true-to-life stories of secrets, betrayal, and the quiet justice that finds the people who've earned it, tap the video on your screen right now. I'll be waiting for you there.